speaker here. The Slovenian Lodge has been in our community in Cleveland since 1919. We have the charter back there. My grandfather and my dad were coal miners, and Bob's going to tell you a little bit of the history of the fraternal unions related to coal mine community, and that's kind of why he's here. I am the president of the Slovenian Lodge, and we are the only active lodge in the state of Washington. There used to be lots of them, Enumclaw, Seattle, Spokane, all over. We've absorbed all the other members, and that's how I met this guy by accident. And he had an article written in the Prospera, which is a Slovenian newspaper that lodge members get each month. And I saw an article, Cleveland, because that's our lodge, was written by this gentleman by the name of Bob Rossi about the coal mine community and the Slovenian lodges, and piqued my interest. I believe I probably emailed you within 10 minutes after reading this article. So we're excited that you're here, and I think the fraternal unions and how they came to be are really interesting and integrals to our history of our community. And I think that's why you're here, to learn some things about coal mines and the lodge and the unions and things such as that. So one other thing, we also are the only private cemetery in Cleveland. The Slovenians have that. I know there's a lot of history, and I brought Bob up to Roslyn, and I couldn't get him out of there. It was starting to get dark. He was walking around. Found it so interesting, huh?
Do you have to be Slovenian to join the lodge?
Nope.
Is there any criteria?
Nope. In fact, I'm glad you asked, because we're actually centering our meeting after this. We have to meet quarterly. We have to elect officers. And so, yeah, if you're interested, stick around afterwards. You can sit in our meeting. I can tell you how to join. Part of joining, and I hope I'm going to touch on this or not, Rob, but is that they did not have, insurance, and they developed their own internal insurance companies. But you are going to share it. But anyway, so hopefully you'll have more questions. Bob's going to share quite a bit about that. And so, as I said, I looked up the Prospera, and I said, man, I got to get a hold of this guy and find out all the research he's been doing over the years. I was on he did a kind of a webinar type thing with some University of Denver. Very learned, very, very intelligent, knows his history. There were some PhDs from different universities, and this guy kind of shut him down, man. He knows his stuff. So I was very impressed. And so I invited him to come up and speak and share his wisdom with us. So I'll let him kind of tell you his background, Mr. Bob Rossi.
Thank you. You know, it's such an honor to speak to a SNPJ lodge. I've been a member of the SNPJ for more than 40 years, and I've never had the opportunity to give back in this way to our folks. So thank you. Really, it's an honor to be here. And I'm not Slovenian, so answers your question. I am also a proud member of the United Mine Workers of America, the Mine Workers Union. And I've been working on this project since 1982. I hope I finish before I die. The goal was originally to write a book. That's not the goal now. It's to create a document to help future researchers. I went to work instead of going to university. Not that going to university isn't work, I don't mean that. I went to work in industrial work and became a union organizer. I was a union organizer for almost 30 years. But I want to leave something to folks who do the research ahead of time or in the future, because I see so much that people get wrong in writing books and talking about miners and ethnic groups and minorities in the mines. So all of my work is focused on Colorado coal mining communities in the 1920s and an account of the 1927-28 strike in Colorado, which was a mass strike of about 12,000 miners statewide, with 3 different unions involved. And it was led by a very radical union called the Industrial Workers of the World, which also existed here in Washington. But I found that in order to understand what happened in Colorado in 1927-28, we have to go back to the 1870s, the 1880s, And we need to look at organizations like the SNPJ. You can't really understand what happened in any mining community anywhere, I think, in the United States without understanding the SNPJ and organizations that were like it. Slovenians were not just miners or mine workers, of course. Slovenians were meat cutters, bartenders, farmers, carpenters, steelworkers, boarding house misses, musicians, tavern owners, and much more. And a lot of my work is about how those occupations intersected to make communities. We had slides prepared today. We're not going to show the slides. I'm going to try to improvise some of that. But, we tend to think of our SNPJ, our Slovene National Benefit Society, as something in the Midwest and from the East Coast, and as something we do for fun. But my research takes up the SNPJ in the West, and I argue that our unions, or rather that our origins, are also here in the West. Also, we think of the SNPJ as Slovenian, but there are two qualifiers to that. First, in many ways, we were an Austrian, Croatian, and Slovenian and Italian organization as well at the time of our founding. And as intermarriage increased, and that became deeper and a greater part of our roots. The second piece is that there's this idea Slovenstvo. Does anyone know what I mean? Slovenstvo. Is the word familiar to anyone? It's the feeling or the sense of being Slovenian. And it's something sentimental perhaps, or in your heart or in your head. But for the Slovenians and for the SNPJ and for all of the intellectuals that led the SNPJ for so long, Slovenstvo became something much greater than that. It became a universal and democratic political principle that applied to all people around the world. Slovenians have this incredible ability to be all-embracing. The SNPJ especially so. The SNPJ is probably the greatest, or one of the greatest showcases of that in the United States. Our lodge, our SNPJ, I maintain modeled democracy, and we taught women and men here how to organize unions and political organizations as well. People weren't just joining for the insurance, although insurance is really important, right? 100 years ago or more. We were also joining, and we joined for social reasons and to hear the languages and participate in cultural activities. But we also joined to learn and practice democracy. And the SNPJ has been an excellent school for that. We'll talk more about that later. As I said, my research is based on events in Colorado, but from the 1890s through the 1930s, Slovenians and others who worked in the western mining regions were incredibly transient. And talking to some of you before we began, I heard some stories. People coming from Jenny Lind, Arkansas, people coming from New Mexico, and Pennsylvania, West Virginia, where I lived. If Slovenians were hard rock miners, people who worked with gold, silver, lead, metal-ferrous miners, they often moved around, and they started as far south as Mexico, moved to Arizona, north to New Mexico and Colorado, and then to Utah, and into Montana, and then into eastern Washington, and sometimes into Canada and Alaska. And if you look at a map or think of it, you see a kind of egg shape or sometimes a diamond, right? And people made that trip. How did they make that trip? How did they know where the work was? The SNPJ really helped, right? Old issues of Prosveta tell you where the work was, where the work wasn't, where the mines were dangerous or where they were on strike, and to stay away. If people were coal miners, and sometimes metal miners and coal miners changed jobs, but rarely, if they were coal miners, they moved from, it was common to start in Mexico, in Kansas or New Mexico, then moved to Colorado, to Wyoming, and Utah, north to Washington, perhaps into Vancouver, and then repeat that circle, right? The lodge provided contacts, as I said, and news of where work was. There's a record of men wearing SNPJ buttons as they hopped freights and were hobos and transients. because sometimes that lodge insignia helped, right? You jumped off a train in a small town, you found your way to the Gostilna, the tavern, and you had a contact there. You had somebody who would likely help you. And having that SNPJ signifier was really important. And during the Depression years, many Slovenians and others left our western coal fields and went to California, St. Louis, Detroit, and Chicago. They took with them traditions of mine worker unionism, and they took traditions of the SNPJ with them also. And they went to those places and built good, strong unions through the Depression years in the 1940s and 50s. And they also built the SNPJ with that. We know also that many Slovenian mine workers here in Washington came through a few areas in California, Utah, Wyoming, and Alaska. Kansas is really important to our story, and we don't think about Slovenians in Kansas, do we? Like we don't think about Slovenians in Jenny Lind either, right? But we were there, and one of the people a lot of my work was based on oral history. So I interviewed a woman, Mary Pastatnik. And Mary went to work at 12 years of age, and then found a position working in a miners' cooperative store at 14. She worked outside of the home until she was married, and she became a leader of the SNPJ. She went to many of the national conventions and participated. So there's something significant there. When I said that the SNPJ became a school for democracy, the SNPJ was the first lodge to give women and men equal standing. It was an example of us modeling democracy, right? And Mary was active also in a very militant mine workers strike in 1921 in Kansas, and she told me, I also marched with women in 1921. I was only 19 and just married and lived in Franklin. It was scary for me, especially when the military moved in. She explained her involvement, and I asked her, she said, how did I get involved with the miners' struggles? Why? I was a coal miner's daughter, and that's all we knew. That's all the whole Breezy world where she lived, Breezy Hill rather. That's all the whole Breezy Hill world talked about. We lived way out in the country, had to walk to school in all kinds of weather. Breezy Hill, population almost 3,000, all nationalities. We all got along. I quit school as I had a job in a home. My mother cried. And I said, my girlfriend works there and I need shoes, so I took the job then at age 14 and a half. And then the cooperative store board members voted for me to work for them in the store. I was the happiest girl in the world. I didn't have much schooling, but as practical experience along the way through life, I learned a whole lot. Talk about strikes, we had them one after another. Talk about strikes. Sometimes one wonders how we survived, but you have to give to the people that came here from the old country. They brought their culture with them. They knew how to make a living. We never was hungry or cold. I often think how brave they were. No money, strange country. And I know that some of you relate very well to that, listening to some of your stories. Another Slovenian woman I spoke with, also an SNPJ secretary, Anna O'Korn, remembered after many years, after the strikes, using kerosene lamps and coal stoves and kerosene stoves, common memories in coal towns. And she recalled that women were lucky if they had a wringer to get the water out of the clothes, which they washed in large tubs with washboards. When strike breakers arrived to break the strike there in Kansas, a decision was made that the men would stay home and do the housework while women would march and protest. And remember, this is the SNPJ and my union, United Mine Workers. A woman who spoke English gave the orders to the women who did not. The women walked or hitched rides on trucks or took trolleys to get to the mines to protest. And they appealed to the strike breakers not to help break the strike. And some of the strike breakers consented, and of course some didn't. And I asked her, well, like, what were you doing there? You know, she said, very typically Slovenian, we all went over to see if we could do some damage. You know, this woman was like 4'9", 4'10" maybe, and you know, and she was proud when she said it. You know, there was a confrontation between the women and the militia, and some of the women claimed that the militia fired shots at them. They were really brave. Mary Pastatnik and Anna O'Korn lived in an environment that was described for me by one-time mine worker John Novak, also Slovenian and also an SNPJ leader. He lived in Augusta, Kansas when I knew him. He said most of the miners were from Austria, Yugoslavia, Germany, France, and Italy, and a few English. Before I went into the mines, most of the miners lived in company houses, and they had a company store where you got most everything you needed. And most little towns had a dance hall where they had dances on weekends. Later in years, most of the miners bought their own homes, and they had gardens and chickens. Some had a cow or two, a few had hogs, and so forth. Some would work on a farm during the harvesting time. Most of the Slovenians belonged to the SNPJ, and there was also a Slovene Progressive Benefit Society, SSPZ, which I think existed here. And there was also an SSPZ lodge. And they always had a meeting on Sunday once a month where you paid your dues, and they had dances and outdoor picnics in the summertime. Most everybody there were strong union men. Now, Slovenians supported a mine worker leader in Kansas called Alex Howitt, who was really an incredible leader, a mine worker, a union leader. And he had an incredible amount. Slovenians were just devoted to him, men and women. He was English or Scottish. And one story was that when a coal company put a young Slovenian man on a strip job, running a steam shovel, and the kid didn't know the work, Howitt and other union leaders called a strike. Most of the strikes they called were illegal. And between 1915 and 1919, Alex Howitt and his union leadership called at least 705 strikes. So think about that, in 4 years, 705 strikes. That's a lot, right? And when they sent Howitt to prison, right? And when Howitt went to prison, all these miners showed up to the courtroom to protest on his behalf, and they told the judge that every day Howitt was in jail, he would not work. It's an incredible sacrifice to make, right? And the SNPJ supported them through that. The SNPJ provided life insurance and assisted Slovenian mine workers and their families during strikes. As I'm saying, we were established as a secular and pro-labor benefit society, and the SNPJ, as I said, was the first lodge to give women and men equal voice and vote. The SNPJ supported strikers during the 1927 Colorado coal miners strike that I've been doing so much work on. And it refused to, on the other hand, to provide benefits to folks to men who crossed the picket lines, there and elsewhere. The SNPJ lodges in the coal fields provided insurance and developed leadership and organizational skills as well. I keep coming back to that. The Slovene Progressive Benefit Society that I mentioned before, and the Slovene Workmen's Benefit Society, both very similar to the SNPJ, both were merged with us, were also established in the western coal fields. Now, I make this argument in my writing that coal mine workers' movements in the late teens and early 1920s in Colorado and probably in other western states emerged in part because Slovenians, Italians, and Mexicans shared a common cultural framework for at least 20 or 30 years. We had a shared identity that went back to the 19th century and lasted into the early years of the Depression, maybe the mid-Depression. We attended many of the same churches. We experienced similar forms of discrimination. We were hated by the Ku Klux Klan, which took power in Colorado and had a friend in the White House at the time. We lived in close proximity to one another in mining towns and mining camps. We shared similar kinds of music, right? Mexican polkas, Slovenian polkas sound a lot alike. We were members of some of the same radical organizations and the same unions. It's hard to understate how important that cross-cultural experience is to our history. We weren't just Slovenians, we weren't just Italians, we were members of the SNPJ that brought us together. Our SNPJ didn't build this alone, but we were key to this. And in this regard, I want to mention that a few years ago, the Western Slavonic Association, which is a Slovenian organization in the Southwest, they merged with another organization Do you think it was a Slovenian organization? No. It was a Mexican organization. It was a very long-standing organization of Mexican working class people and farmers. Common cultural framework still exists in many areas. But what did this mean in 1920? Well, it meant that we were all enemies of the Ku Klux Klan. As I said, we were Catholics, primarily immigrants, union members. We had great Slovenian intellectuals in the United States. Louis Adanic, who is coming back into popularity. His book, A Native Son, is an incredible book about Slovenia. I hope people have read it or will read it if it's ever reprinted. We made wine and we enjoyed slivovica, and I brought some slivo with me. Please have some. Not now. You know, we were everything that the Ku Klux Klan hated, right? And the Ku Klux Klan spoke for our employers a lot of the time, right? They were the front for the coal companies. And as I said, the Ku Klux Klan is a major force in this country. They had a friend in the White House. A Klansman was governor of Colorado. They controlled law enforcement in many coal mining communities and public institutions. One of the people I interviewed was a woman, Sophie Garlick. She was also an SNPJ secretary in southern Colorado. Her dad and two brothers were active in the 1927-28 strike. And she said to me, I can truthfully say that this was the worst period of our lifetime during that strike. Strikers got some commodities once a month from the union. The miners and strike leader Milka Savage, who I'll talk about in a bit, would picket the mines, but they were just too many scads, people who crossed border lines. They just would not help the strikers. I can remember working for 50 cents a day cleaning a house from 7 in the morning until 7 at night, 7 days a week. My family was terribly in debt for rent, groceries, and utilities. Food was scarce. There was 10 of us children and mother and dad to feed. We really had to struggle to live. A miner's life was really a hard life. My father worked in the mines in Pennsylvania, Kentucky, Virginia, Wyoming, Utah, and Colorado. Our story is pretty typical. That's real transients, right? But that isn't atypical. Her father returned to the mine after the strike, but her brothers were blacklisted. Her father joined the SNPJ 2 years after our founding. She thought that the SNPJ was great for insurance and for our dances. Sophie finished 8th grade and then went to work as a housekeeper. And then she went to work at Woolworths for 6 days a week. And she thought that was a real promotion at the time. And she had to lie about her age. And at Woolworths, she got $7.50 a week for 6 days. And she gave her parents $5 of that and kept $2.50 for herself to buy clothes. She worked for 53 years in retail. Right? She never stopped. Her husband was a miner. They put up 850 quarts of fruit and corn and canned everything they could each year. 850 quarts. You know, I just did some canning, and 2 days I was exhausted. 850 quarts, right? On top of working 53 years. She remembered that her dad kept a beautiful garden. I think that's also something very typical in the mining communities. Kept rabbits and chickens, but they couldn't always afford to feed them. They hunted rabbits, but they had to save and buy money. They had to save money to buy rifle shells to hunt. So you're at a point where you're working in a mine and you can't even afford shells to hunt, right, to feed yourself. I also argue a lot that Slovenian women, particularly second generation Slovenian women, made extraordinary efforts at education, at attaining education in the coal fields, more so than women in many other ethnic groups, I think, in the 20s and 30s. Sometimes this took 20 or 30 years. Right? Women would do correspondence classes. They would take courses here and there. Sometimes they had to move, and moving was important in order to finish their education. Slovenian children often came to the United States with some education that other kids in mining camps didn't have, and sometimes this created friction between children. I've got some other points I want to share, and I'm watching my watch here. Slovenian women in the 1920s in Colorado began asserting their independence early on by traveling for long distances to dances, sometimes an hour or more, and in 1920 or 25, an hour was far, right? Slovenian women were central to the alliance that transformed the Democratic Party and got President Roosevelt elected during the Depression years. At least in Colorado, they were the center of that. Some Slovenians worked in mining before coming to the United States, so that stereotype of the dumb immigrant who doesn't know the work is wrong in many ways. A Slovenian tavern owner in Oak Creek, Colorado, did a remarkable thing. He and other people in the community, they recreated a small Slovenia, right? So the stream ran through the bar, right? Typical of old Slovenia, and there were little water wheels going through the creeks. I didn't really appreciate this until I went to Bosnia and saw it there and thought, wow, this is what Oak Creek, Colorado looked like. People tried to bring part of the homeland with them. Some information suggests that when the flu epidemics hit, Slovenians in the western mining states tried very hard to adopt the children of parents who died. And that sounds, okay, great, but you know, a lot of people gave children up to orphanages or let the children shift to them for themselves, right? Slovenians didn't do that. I haven't found a record of Slovenians doing that in Colorado. The adoptions were often not legal. They took kids into their homes and built extended and blended families. And blended families are quite a phenomenon in western mining states. Slovenians were among the leaders in the cooperative store movement in Colorado, you know, forming co-ops to get around the company stores. Very important. Slovenians probably gave the polkas to Mexicans, right? Right? You know, I grew up, when I was a kid, my parents listened to Lawrence Welk, and I hated Lawrence. I hated it. And my 30th birthday, I was in a tavern in southern Colorado. Okay, I'd had a few too many, but I started hearing, I hear this music, and I think, wait a minute, I know that. And I listened, and it was a live Mexican band in this tavern, and I realized they were playing Who Stole the Kishka? Wow, and I just got back into polka music, and my car is full of polka CDs. But Slovenians in the western mining states also created a crossover in music that took polka tunes and added lyrics of songs that were popular in the day. And some of us, I think, are old enough to remember territory bands. The United States was divided into territories, and certain bands stayed within the territory and traveled. And those were members of the American Federation of Musicians, the Musicians Union. And they had really much better contracts and much better salary and benefits, of course, than people who weren't in the union. And Slovenians headed for the territory bands so often. I think more than any other ethnic group. And the territory bands lasted into the 1960s. So we have that also. It would be hard to understate how much the coal operators hated the SNPJ. During the 1927 Colorado strike, it was said that union miners who died could not receive Catholic Church funerals. And that was Colorado Fuel and Iron Company interfering with the Catholic Church. Colorado Fuel and Iron Company was owned by the Rockefellers. And in those days, when an SNPJ member died, it was common for us to assign a couple of members to stay with the body in the house. People didn't go to funeral parlors, right? Funeral parlors were kind of an innovation later on. It was like a guard. You know, the body was in the house. There was an honor guard there provided by the SNPJ. And when the funeral happened, people processed in large numbers, wearing sashes, similar to the one in the back. And the coal companies were so angry at the SNPJ and so suspicious of us that when an SNPJ member died in Crested Butte, which is in central Colorado, in 1927 or 1928, the companies made sure that that was the last time our lodge was able to process wearing our colors at a member's funeral. right? They investigated the SNPJ and made it really hard for us for many, many years. We all know about mine accidents and fatalities in the mines. The Delagua mine disaster in Colorado killed 79 miners, 26 of them were from Yugoslavia. The Cherry Hill, Illinois mine disaster took the lives of 20 SNPJ members and caused our SNPJ to give more aid to the families of those miners. So much so that the SNPJ required an assessment from each member to pay for that. In Clay Ellen, you had the fire in 1918 that wiped out the possessions of many SNPJ members, and our lodge again provided benefits. The flu epidemic of 1918 cost our SNPJ more than $135,000 in benefits. That's well over $4 million today. Right? We paid out $4 million in benefits. And that flu epidemic hit every coal mining community, right? Every steel producing community. The 1921 flood in Pueblo, Colorado wiped out the area where Slovenians and Mexicans and Italians lived. And it was a horrible, I think 500 or more people died. Again, the SNPJ paid the way where we could. So we were going to do some slides, but we're not going to do the slides. I'm going to improvise here and then wrap up. One of the slides is a picture of a boarding house, and I want to emphasize that we think about boarding houses in the mines, and we think like, oh great, it's a hotel, you know, Best Western. Really, the women who did the work in the boarding houses were skilled workers. They had to learn how to negotiate. They had to learn how to cook for large numbers of people. They had to be really tough with people who came in drunk or wouldn't pay or tried to skip out. The typical thing in Colorado was that when you went to a boarding house and they asked for a room, she looked at your hands to see if there were calluses, thank you, sorry. And if there weren't, go somewhere else. Right? That was your qualification. I had a picture of the Pueblo steel mill, which was the largest and modern steel mill in the West for many, many years, generations, I think into the 1950s. It was built in the 1880s. And Pueblo was really important to our SNPJ story. In 1901, Martin Conda established a newspaper called Glas Slobode, the Voice of Freedom in Pueblo, with Ivan Medica and others. This is the roots of our newspaper, Prosveta, and other Slovenian newspapers. There was a Slovenian Free-Thinking Benefit Federation and a newspaper, Proletaric, also that came out of Martin Conda's work. They were known for, the newspaper was known for publishing the names of strike breakers and trying to shame them. It was a free thought publication, meaning that it was atheist or agnostic. They also published wonderful classic literature. Slovenians were really interested in the classics, right? And on the other side of Pueblo, from Martin Conda, was a Slovenian Catholic church led by Father Cyril Zupan and the Slovenian Catholic organizations who bitterly opposed Conda and the SNPJ and some of the other groups. Pueblo has the only Slovenian public housing community that I know of. It's named after Father Cyril. It's also the only town I know where the term Bojan is used. Does anybody know that term, Bojan? It refers to Slovenians. And it was started, it was an insult originally, but Slovenians picked it up, and now there's a Bojan Days in Pueblo, right? It's a really great pizza. But it's a term that describes Slovenians, and also the term Granish, which I'm not familiar with. You may have heard referring to Slovenians as well. There were probably 5 Slovenes in Pueblo in 1885, but by 1910 there were like 2,400. And Colorado, isolated Colorado, had 8 Slovenian newspapers. It's a lot. Here in Another slide we were going to show was a picture of Robert Harlan. He was a Washington mine worker union leader in the late teens and 20s. He ran against John L. Lewis, famous United Mine Workers leader. He probably won. The election was probably stolen. He's here from Washington State. He had tremendous support from Slovenes in Washington, Robert Harlan. I mentioned Milka Sablic in passing. She was a strike leader in 1927-28. She was 19 years old. She was Croatian. She was called Flaming Milka because she wore these really red dresses out on the prairies in Colorado and led these picket lines. 19-year-old Croatian girl. She was often attacked by the police and the militia on mounted horses. She had her wrists broken at one point. Milka was really, really incredible. Somebody should make a movie about her. Interesting. I think her life was in some ways very typical of the people and the women around her. Her sister had lost 3 babies and a husband before she was 23 years old, right? It's hard to think about. And there were 17 people living under one roof in her family, right? 4 boarders and the rest of her family under one roof. I had a picture of the Polish Hall in Walsenburg, Colorado. Really, lodges were so fundamental to establishing civil society in the western mining regions, right? There was just no law and order until lodges arrived. There was a very different concept of government. The Trinidad Slovenian Hall was probably, Trinidad, Colorado was probably used as a strike headquarters. So, one more point before I summarize, wrap up. I mentioned Martin Kanda, Frank Petrich, Jose Zavertnik. They were founders of what became our Prosveta. The church-related lodges, unlike the SNPJ, required that a priest vouch for each member, right? So you didn't get in if the priest, if you were buds, going to confession, whatever. But Konda, Petrich, and Zavertnik and others wouldn't have that. And one of the people I interviewed, I'll say I love the man, really, was an SNPJ leader in Denver, incredible musician. He told me this story that in the coal mine camps where he lived when he was a kid, the priests would come dressed as a devil on Easter if you hadn't been to church and put some money in the plate, right? And this was a factor for the SNPJ organizing, right? Like, imagine, you're there with your children and the children see the devil outside on the porch. They're scared, right? And the SNPJ said, no, we're not having that. We're secular, we're free thought, we're open to working class people, come on in. Okay, summary. This only skims the surface of what I've got. Some of my conclusions are that our SNPJ was vital to the labor movement in the Western mining states. We were a school for democracy and organizing. Our lodges provided a buffer between us and the employers and between our families in harsh conditions as well. Our SNPJ helped unite us to other ethnic groups, especially Mexicans, Italians, and Croatians, without whom we could not have progressed. We needed their help, they needed ours. We have an incredible history of activism in SNPJ and a history of reaching out to others that we should be very proud of and that connects us to social movements. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you. Now, we'll open it up to questions. Historically, I told you when my grandfather came to Ellis Island, Grandpa Platnick, Ellis Island, and then he went to Minnesota, Colorado, New Mexico, Black Diamond, where my dad was born, and then ended up in Clallam. So he traveled that route, and I think a lot of our parents and grandparents kind of did the same thing. They just, Ellis Island and Clallam, it didn't happen. It's just, and how we got there, I wouldn't know. Travel, how do you travel in those days, in the teens and those years? But So when he came here and started, when the lodge was started, he came in like 21, 22. My dad was a couple years old. And they started, and where up in Clem there was a lodge meeting hall. Some of us might remember that. Okay, used to be, then it became Kingdom Hall. Now somebody lives in there. But I remember 5, 6 years old. I have some pictures of me at 5 or 6 years old with my grandparents in there, and they would have great times. You know, a lot of wine, a lot of slivovitz, a lot of song, a lot of dance. But that kept them together. And one other thing that we talked about, my dad didn't, until he got into school, he couldn't speak English. He only spoke Slovenian. They made fun of him when he was, 5, 6 years old because he didn't know English, But he was steeped in the culture, and I'm very fortunate that I had my grandparents, like many of you, and we can carry this tradition. So that's the reason we're sharing here and talking about this a little bit. So, questions for my bud here?
Well, I know they traveled by train, but how did they get the money to pay for the fare?
So I met a lot of people a lot of folks I interviewed borrowed money from priests. Some folks migrated through Europe. They didn't just catch a boat in Istria and get on, right? They migrated, and that's where people got mining experience, right? If they went north into what was then what became Poland, and then went west, they could work in the mines. Right?
So you're saying,
or in France.
they kind of like had to know people here that would
Or people
help
said,
them,
or
or
people
that
said,
would,
or people
give
were
them
saying-
money to,
That's right.
get train fare and stuff. But I thought, how could they travel, when they had hardly money to buy anything,
So the requirement in Ellis Island was, I think, $5 for most of the time. And then, but if you look at passenger lists on the Ellis Island website, you can see how much money people had. So everyone had to have at least, I think $5. But some people arrived with 25 and 30 and 50. But also, tavern owners were really important to this, right? Tavern owners were bankers because we didn't have banks, right? And tavern owners kept our money. Right? So you took a loan out based on people were then indebted to the tavern owner. Hopefully he was a nice guy, right?
Right.
They weren't always.
You talked about the polka music and so on, and a lot of us here, our parents watch Molly B on TV.
Me too.
And so, we watch it every Saturday night too, but they're in the states that she mainly has her shows in. There seems to be, like you were talking about, a lot of the regional polka bands. And here, in our area, I don't really remember any of those. Do you, Kenny, when you remember?
There were some that came over. Remember, we'd have it in the float. They came over from Seattle and stuff.
Yeah.
Button box, the button box. Yeah.
But it's really interesting watching that on Molly B, especially after listening to you, because wanting to kind of know who is Croatian bands or Slovenian, and it's just really interesting.
Go ahead, please.
Cleveland seems like it has a lot of Slovenian. I love the banjo.
Right. And it has its own polka sound.
Yeah, it's
Cleveland sound.
Slovenian.
Yeah, the Cleveland sound. So it's really interesting because, this poor guy from the Habsburg Empire, Maximilian, who went to Mexico to take over Mexico, right, and was killed there, right? A lot of Slovenians came with him, and I don't think they wanted to be there, but after Maximilian was killed by the Mexicans, they had no place to go. So one theory is they drifted north and became miners, metal miners in what became the American Southwest. And then they taught polka music along the way. It isn't the Cleveland style. It's something else that's very unique, though. And that's where we get this mixture of music. Please. No, please. Anybody.
You shared your little story about Frankie Ankovich, and I think the majority of us have grown up with him too, so maybe if you just share what you knew about Frankie.
My first lodge secretary's father taught him how to play. And I was kind of gifted to go to his 85th birthday party when he was retiring. It was quite an event. It was nice. So his story, as I understood it, is that his family lived in West Virginia, where I lived, and they were on strike. And his family moved to Cleveland rather than cross the picket lines. It's quite a commitment. And while until Frankie's father could find work, there was nothing doing. So other strikers taught Frankie how to play the button box. At least that's one story. It's the story. It's the story I like. It's the story I heard.
My great-grandfather's buried in the plot here in Cleveland. And there's just a few of the relatives are there, but the rest of them are in Roslyn with the CFU plots. So I've always wondered why. We've got some there, and some in CFU plots. So can you speculate at all why someone would choose? I mean, was there what kind of development maybe the CFU was going through as opposed to SNPJ?
It's a really good question. So I think part of it goes into, we think today about borders that didn't exist then, right? So a lot of Slovenians were not Slovenian on paper, they were Austrian, right? And the line between Slovenia and Croatia is much different than now, so people might have related more to one than the other. The other thing is that the CFU organized a lot earlier than the SNPJ did and has a longer history in the United States. It started out as the National Croatian Society and then became CFU a few years later. And the National Croatian Society started as a very liberal, progressive organization that you weren't going to join unless you were liberal and progressive, right? So I think some of it was political. People identified with a political line in one organization and not with another. There were a lot of religious Croatian organizations as well. So if somebody went to the CFU and they were making a political decision, right? The CFU and SNPJ were very similar in many ways, right? They weren't opposed, right? Not like the Croatian Fraternal Union or the SNPJ and the Serb National Federation, for instance, right? The other thing about it is that the SNPJ founders didn't arrive here really knowing what to do, how to form an organization. So they looked in a couple different places. They looked to the National Croatian Society for advice and an organization called the Ancient Order of United Workmen and the AOUW. And the AOUW was an insurance society that was kind of inclusive. It was kind of racist also. Let's be honest. And the SNPJ picked up its accounting methods and its insurance methods, and the CFU, I think, did also. But it left the prejudices, or tried to leave the prejudices behind. So I think it was also a question of when people happened to be there. Does that answer you? Does that help?
So we'll back to the burial thing. My grandparents, my grandfather died in the 40s, and my grandmother died in 57. And so I wasn't really aware of everything that was going on. But would the lodge pay for their burial at that time, or how did that work? Do you know? I mean, just curious.
I think it was a question of what plan they had with the lodge, but I've never heard of
I remember
the lodge not. I mean, the SNPJ, one of the differences with the AOUW and some of those organizations were burial societies, and
right.
The SNPJ had a larger mission. It wasn't just burial, it was life insurance, it was...
And I remember there was a lodge member reading, and of course we didn't know,
right.
What they were saying and what was going on really, but yeah, just kind of, now, we look back at that and we think, geez, I don't remember, any of my family paying for their burial or whatever. I mean, of course, I wouldn't have cared anyway. I was 11 years old. It didn't make any difference.
It's a difference. It mattered to me as a child. The first dead person I ever saw was a child my age who was a distant relative who did not have the money to be buried in the funeral parlor and was laid out in the kitchen of the house. And I remember going as a child, and you know, we had prayer cards, and I wanted to see his spirit.
Yeah. Well, I remember the prayer cards.
You know,
Yeah.
and I made myself see it, right? But you know, I'm sorry, that was a digression. I'm sorry.
I remember the prayer cards too, you know, and I was looking at.
That was a part of my family that was like really poor and was really involved in the church. And this woman, this child's mother had 13 children and 11 of them had died. And the priest kept saying, you know, keep trying. And the rest of my family was doing better. They worked in union representing coal mines. They had other jobs. They were a little upwardly mobile, and they were lodge members of one or union members. Funerals were very different. I'm sorry for the digression.
No, I think the insurance had a lot to do with the burial. I don't think we realized that. It was
Like I said, at the time, it didn't matter to me.
But all of us that are lodge members have insurance policies.
So it's a death benefit.
Right, yeah, being in there,
Rather than
so
a
that
burial.
was it. So, yeah, so that's, to be a lodge member, I'm trying to get, some of my family members, for the kids in there, but they have to pay insurance. And insurance is, I did some comparison, a lodge insurance is a lot more expensive, but you're become a lodge member. So when I looked at some things, but yeah, that's part of it, because they couldn't get insurance, so they developed their own insurance company, and that's really
You know, I know
what
my
lodges have to
grandparents-
do with all that stuff, and that's how we merged into what we are today.
Yeah, because they have a nice plot and stuff there, so
Yep.
that's
That's right.
paid for it, you know.
It's really, think about what's behind that, right? It's really hard to get insurance of any kind if you were a coal miner. Right? What was your chance of living, and how long were you going to?
High risk.
Right, high risk jobs, right? Or steel workers. The occupations where people from the Balkans and Southern and Eastern Europe were concentrated were the high risk occupations, right? Weren't going to get insurance just anywhere.
My dad thought John L. Lewis walked on water. He told my mother, don't go to the doctor, you'll break John L. Lewis. Yeah. He talked about him, he lived to be 92, and I always thought John L. Lewis was the president of the miners thing. I never knew. He said someone else who had the support of Washington.
Lewis there were like a couple different John L. Lewises, right, in the
Oh,
course of his
oh.
lifetime. I mean, he changed a lot. So in the time of like the late teens and early 20s when he was taking office, he was not a nice guy. He was pretty corrupt, and he had a lot of opposition. And one of his main opponents was from here in Washington. The guy later became mayor of Seattle, I should say. In 1931, he was mayor of Seattle. And there's a beautiful photograph of him standing on the, like by a Hooverville, you know, one of the shacks that people lived in during the Depression on the Seattle waterfront. He was pushed out of the Union for opposing John L. John L. had very mixed reads through the 1920s, and then in the 1930s, when most of us begin to really think about him, he looks like a really good guy. But that's not a universally shared opinion. I come from a household also that thought John L. was. And I had neighbors in West Virginia who had pictures of John L. and Jesus on their wall. Really old people. I had a neighbor who could tell you out of memory every rate in the mines for 40 or 50 years easily without looking on paper. And he had a picture of Jesus and John next to one another in his living room. Anybody else? Did I bore everyone?
Well, and this is his first time to our fair area, and we'll hope that he will come up again and visit us in the future. One last thing, if you've choose to do so, we have a little donation jar back, or actually it's a coal miner's pail back there to help with his expenses, because he drove up here from Salem, Oregon, a couple of nights in a motel just to be here and share with us guys today. So thank you, my friend, I appreciate it. Help yourself to the rest of the homemade Slovenian cookies. And the sleeve of it's over there. Go ahead, Charlie, I know you want one. But anyway, thank you again for coming. I really appreciate this and hope we can do something like this again.
Why not? My brother, why not?